Good morning and welcome to the Morning Scoop for Tuesday, November 3rd. This is your daily Buckeye fix. I'm Tom Orr. The Rutgers game is 4 days away. The game against Michigan is in 39 days. Today is Election Day, and under a new NCAA rule, no teams can hold any organized events today so that players have a chance to go vote if they haven't already. So that means no practice for the Buckeyes today, and later today we'll be talking to Ryan Day and some assistant coaches. The usual player interviews that we'd normally have on a Tuesday will have to wait until tomorrow. So we will have interviews for you later today at Buckeye Scoop. It'll just be some different folks than you would normally see on Tuesdays. So since it is Tuesday, it is Chalk Talk Tuesday on the Morning Scoop. My guest is Buckeye Scoop's X's and O's guru, Ross Fulton. Ross, this was a week when it seemed like the Buckeyes were going to be in for a tougher challenge in running the ball than they were against Nebraska. But Saturday night, it sure felt like they were more consistently successful in moving the ball on the ground. What did they do to make that happen?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things, both in scheme and execution. I think that they came out with a game plan. They used a lot of two tight ends relative for them, at least, and a lot of shifting in motion to Penn State plays a lot of cover three against Ohio State and wants to bring one of those safeties down against the run. And so they were kind of messing with how Penn State does their safety rotation in terms of who comes into the box. I think they had a good game plan in terms of focusing on, they used a lot of under center and pistol to run a lot of outside zone. And then they, when they're more standard offset, they use more tight zone and mid zone. But I thought that in terms of execution, Master Teague in particular, I thought made a big improvement from the first game to the second game in terms of seeing the hole. He's never going to be the shiftiest guy, but he to be a successful run cut downhill runner, which is what he is, he basically has to put his foot in the ground and cut when it's there. And he did a better job of that, especially like on wide zone. And so, I thought the offensive line too did a better job of establishing double teams. And so all that worked together, I think, too. This is going to be a team that's driven by Justin Fields and Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson. But obviously they need, a more successful run game to support that. And, I think they had like a 46% rushing success rate, which is pretty good.
Yeah, for on the first week against Nebraska, 4 of the offensive linemen graded out as champions. This week against Penn State, all 5 of them graded out as champions. If 5 offensive linemen out of 5 grade out as champions, you've probably had a pretty good day moving the ball on the ground. I want to touch on something that you mentioned there that people might not completely understand. The use of movement and motion to sort of mess with the defense a little bit. I mean, that's something that there are coordinators that are kind of known for specifically for using motion, like Matt Canada, for example. His offenses use a ton of pre-snap motion and shifts to mess with defenses. Can you just sort of explain to people like what does that do to a defense? Is that explain how you can maybe it sort of tips off what the defense might be looking at doing and mess with what the defense is trying to do?
Yeah, and so that's one way you can use motion, obviously, to tip, especially your quarterback and passing game in terms of whether you're getting man or zone. But in the run game, what they were doing is, particularly when they had 2 tight ends in the game, they line them up on, let's say, on the left side and flip them to the right side. And what that makes the defense do is reestablish the strength of the offense. And so as a defense, once you've set yourself to the strength, now suddenly the strength's flipped to the other side. You need to determine, are you going to flip all the way over? Or are you going to just shift over? It just kind of messes with the defense's key. Similarly, they used a lot of, especially under center. I mean, we saw with the first play, they handed off to Garrett Wilson on the fly sweep, and then they faked that quite a bit, especially to run, like duo and wide zone their base plays. And again, that forces in your mind, think of like the 2 safeties, right? And when they see that motion, one of them has to come up to account for the motion. So that should pull them out of being able to provide run support to the run play.
Now, something that Ohio State did that was very different in the run game, week 2 against Penn State from week 1 against Nebraska, it was kind of the opposite, I think, from what people would traditionally think of as like the way Urban Meyer would run his quarterbacks. Urban Meyer would, when it was JT Barrett, it was like he'd have 4 carries, 5 carries in the games that they were going to win by 1,000,000 points. And then when it was Penn State or Oklahoma or Michigan, it was like, okay, this is going to be an 18 carry game for JT Barrett. For Ohio State, Justin Fields had a ton of carries against Nebraska and then was basically a non-factor most of the night in the run game at Penn State. So why was he not a big part of the game plan? Is that, are they trying to protect him? Is that, kind of messing for Penn State, that Penn State was probably expecting him to be a big part of the game plan, and then you sort of mess with what they were planning to do, like something else? Like what do you think was behind that?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of both those factors. Against Nebraska, even though he had 15 carries, when you really break it down, he maybe had like 2 or 3 on designed read plays. So he wasn't a big part there. The problem was against Nebraska, they were just kind of running their base zone read play where like you need the quarterback to account for the unblocked backside defensive end. And he wasn't really keeping. And so that's why some of the problems, as we talked about, came against Nebraska. Whereas against Penn State, they had a plan without using Fields as a runner to kind of hold those back unblocked defenders, which is also part of why they were probably more successful running the ball against Penn State. And so that came in a combination of ways. When they did run tight zone, they usually would have either the tight end block back on that unblocked defender, or they use quite a few run pass options where instead of, so Fields is still reading, but instead of reading to give or to keep to run, he would read to either give or keep and throw a quick backside hitch. And since, Penn State was kind of using soft corners in their cover 3 scheme, that was open a lot. And they also, as we maybe, as I get into in my article, they use a lot of other constraint plays in the passing game, bootlegs and the like. So they did a lot of things that you would think of teams that generally have a less mobile quarterback doing to constrain the defense. I mean, I think part of that, again, is I do think that there is a desire to not run him, generally speaking, at least in this regular season. And I also think that Penn State was the way they were, you could see them defending the backside. They were what they've done in the past against Ohio State. They did some again, which is bring sort of what I would consider an overhang defender. So kind of like a linebacker or safety that's lined up between like the offensive tackle and the slot receiver, bring him down to sort of account for the quarterback run game. And so that kind of negated that aspect of their game plan by not running Fields.
Now, you mentioned you had that article coming out later today at Buckeye Scoop. One thing I got a little sneak peek, and it's pretty darn good. You guys are gonna like it. One thing you wrote about in there is how Ryan Day always tries to pair up his run plays with play action off of the same look, and that's something that sort of seems obvious. Like you want to kind of play off of what you're doing before, and have them thinking, okay, it's a run, and now it's all of a sudden it's pass, or vice versa. And going back to the 8-play Tecmo Super Bowl playbook days, like there was often a run play and a pass play out of the same formation and motion. So, I mean, is that you felt compelled to mention it? So, is that something that Day is kind of unusual in doing?
I don't think in theoretically, no. In practice, it can be. Sometimes you don't see it as much as you think you would see it. I know it seems straightforward, but I think what happens is a lot of times people will either have that in the playbook but not implement it together in a way that works like it is a coherent whole in a game, or their play action passes won't exactly mirror the run play, and that's where you can get into trouble. So I think one really good example from the Penn State game was that 4th down pass to Chris Olave. So I mentioned again that they'd gotten pistol a lot, and they've been running either wide zone or what's called duo, which is the easiest way to think about it is power, where all the front side blocks down, except without the guard pulling around. And so to make up for that, a lot of teams will bring a wide receiver kind of in like short motion, and he'll down block on the edge. And so they kept doing that with Chris Olave. So he'd come in the motion block, Then finally on 4th and 1, he comes in the same motion, they fake it, and he runs a deep crossing route. And it is pretty wide open. And so that's a good example of and I think Day said after the game, to paraphrase, and basically it's nerve-wracking, but you put those plays in the game plan, and you got to call them in those situations because we've been building on it. So making plays look alike is basically an offensive fundamental 101, but coaches don't always implement it necessarily the way they should.
Yeah, after the game, Day said his heart was in his throat when that ball was in the air to Olave, and he said after that drive, they went for it twice on 4th down in that drive. He said after that drive, he thought he needed a drink. So he earned it. It was good. Couple calls. It took some guts and worked out for him. So I guess he earned it. Other side of the ball, we spent all week talking about how the Buckeyes were going to have to limit Sean Clifford in the run game for Penn State, and the Ohio State coaching staff apparently agreed and did a pretty darn good job of it. So what did they do to hold Clifford in check on the ground?
Yeah, so they made sure that they were having their defensive ends account for the running back and their linebackers account for the quarterback. So they use a little bit different game plan than what they used last year. Last year, we talked about this last week where they had then Sam linebacker Pete Werner follow Pat Fryermuth everywhere he went. And instead of doing that this year, they stayed more in their base alignment to make sure like their linebackers were over, again, in that sort of overhang spot between the slot receiver and the offensive tackle. And then whenever Penn State was running a replay, again, they do what's called a scrape exchange. And so basically that means the defensive end and the linebacker are trading responsibilities. So the defensive end would make a beeline for the running back, which we saw, Ohio State have several tackles for loss doing that. And then the linebacker would either loop around or fold in and account for the quarterback. So to get, to mess essentially with Clifford's reads where he's not sure whether he should give or pull because, his read is the defensive end and that guy's crashing down, which indicates him he should pull. But then the linebacker's looping around to account for him. And so Ohio State, and this obviously gets into some of the second half issues that we'll probably talk about, were first and foremost focused on eliminating the Penn State run game. And I think they did a pretty successful job of that and pretty much forced Penn State to be one-dimensional.
Yeah, that first half, Penn State, Sean Clifford, I think, was 2 for 7 for 29 yards through the air, something like that. And then in the second half, it was a completely different story. They moved the ball real well through the second half. And, some of that was on kind of tip your cap plays where Jahan Dotson just made some just superhuman catches. But you also wrote about how they were using some run pass option looks to mess with the Ohio State linebackers there.
Yeah. So, and they did that in the first half, but it wasn't really successful. And so, for one example I can think of is, so when we're talking about that zone read scrape exchange, they did that. And Penn State also had a wide receiver to that same side where Clifford was reading, run a slant, but Marcus Hooker jumped it because Ohio State had clearly prepared to basically have the defense move and with that RPO. And so what Penn State did in the second half was go deep in the playbook and do some pretty exotic run pass options, for lack of a better word. So a couple that they hit well were a couple of times they ran what's called power read and then had Fryermuth stay to block and then he'd basically delay release on a drag across the field. And so they hit that one a couple of times. They also switched where they were doing their RPOs. So if they're running, let's say, zone read to the right, they would have the backside single wide receiver to the left run the slant. And so Clifford, that's obviously a harder read because he has to make that decision pre-snap because he's not looking at the defenders that he's reading essentially. So he's basically pre-snap saying, okay, Ohio State's playing their standard cover three. We know the linebackers are going to come up. So I'm basically making an educated guess that throw is going to be there. And so they hit that a few times. And, obviously people get frustrated at the corners in that situation, but it's really not their fault because in Ohio State's base cover three, those corners are playing with high and outside leverage. Essentially, they want to funnel those receivers to the middle. You have a deep safety, but then in cover three, you have 3 deep defenders and 4 underneath defenders. And the 2, what are called hook curl zones, were sort of where that slant hits, are supposed to be linebackers. But as we talked about before, the Ohio State focus was on, we're going to stop the run. So those linebackers were playing pretty aggressively on the run action, even later in the game when they were up a couple scores. And so that it was essentially kind of like an undefended zone. So at some level, you tip your hat to Penn State for making good adjustments. On another level, there are things Ohio State could have done to counteract that. And they did it a little bit, playing a little bit more man coverage to change what the cornerback was. But, either they didn't want to, or they just, they were up. We've already limited them running the ball. We're going to stick with that and make them prove that they can throw it their way back into this game, which being up a couple scores, remained unlikely.
Now, Ohio State has a few games coming up where they will be very big favorites. You get Rutgers, you're at Maryland. So there's a couple games where there's probably not a whole lot of concerns, but what to you is the biggest concern coming out of that Penn State game? Something that you think they're going to have to get fixed in order to finish this year the way they want to?
Yeah. Offensively, I'm not so sure it's a concern per se, but I would like to see them finish better inside the 10-yard line. Really, to me, again, a lot of focus on the defense in the second half, but the reason that was even a game or, Penn State was in a reasonable striking distance is because Ohio State had 3 trips inside the 10-yard line that resulted in a total of 3 points. Now, obviously, you don't, you know, expect that your starting kicker is going to get hurt and miss a field goal, and then you're on to a walk on. But Ohio State needs to not be kicking field goals in that situation. I mean, that's literally what happened against Clemson last year. So it's a little bit of deja vu. That is one area where I do think Justin Fields as a runner could be utilized more, because, you know, when you're down there, Urban Meyer always loves to talk about this. You lose the vertical passing threat. So safeties can get closer to the line of scrimmage to play the run. And so adding that extra runner certainly helps. So offensively, that'd be one thing I would look for. I'm not sure they're going to run Justin Fields against the Rutgers of the world, but, you know, I think down the line, defensively, it's more even than scheme. It's now depth at defensive back. I mean, if you know, we don't know Cam Brown's status. You know, I noted at the last few series that in place of Marcus Williamson at kind of that corner safety hybrid spot, Josh Proctor was playing there. You know, I don't know if that's because Williamson got banged up or it was because of performance. They decided to get, and obviously Josh Proctor great as a champion. So I think, you know, I certainly think that based on what we've seen from him the first 2 weeks, I think that he needs to have a bigger role in the secondary. You know, I continue to think that Ohio State, they actually are changing up coverages more this year than they did last year. And I think they're going to continue to need to do so because they just don't have, you know, the Jeff Okudos and Damon Arnett's to basically say this is what we're going to do and we're going to keep doing it. And so I think that's going to put more of a premium on mixing it up a little bit more in the secondary in terms of coverage schemes.
Ross's article is going to be up a little later on today at Buckeye Scoop. As I mentioned, I got a preview of it before we hit record. It includes a ton more information than we had time to get into here. Well worth your time. So make sure you check that out at buckeyescoop.com a little later on today. And that is just one great reason to join buckeyescoop.com. Just do yourself a favor. Here's a life hack. Just make coffee at home twice this month. Just twice. Instead of going out for it, spend that money to get access to our incredible team of insiders, plus all sorts of great members-only content. You can sign up today at buckeyescoop.com, get immediate access to our incredible team of insiders, our board, all sorts of great members-only stuff. And also make sure you check out our great network of podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, Spotify, all the places you can find podcasts. Just search Buckeye Scoop to find all of those. You can subscribe right there. Also, please leave us a 5-star rating and review while you're at it. We mean it. That really does help us get new listeners. So if you are listening on your iPhone right now, just go ahead and hit 5 stars for us on this one and any other Buckeye Scoop podcast you listen to. It really does help us. So we appreciate your help with all of that. Thank you guys for listening. Have a great day. We will talk to you tomorrow.